Hello, my name is John Roskam. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs. Welcome to this series of conversations between myself and former Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbott, about the Australian way of life. The Australian way of life that we are so fortunate to enjoy is currently being threatened. The ideas of a fair go, freedom of speech, commitment to private enterprise being challenged. At the Institute of Public Affairs, we believe the benefits of the Australian way of life must and should be extended to all Australians. In this, the first of three conversations I have with Tony, we talk about the coronavirus health crisis. We discuss the impact of public policy experts on the response of governments, and we also examine the split between the attitude of the media and the rest of the country to how we work and how we stay in jobs. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Tony Abbott, welcome to the Institute of Public Affairs for this conversation about the Australian way of life. I've got the lockdown stubble. You're looking fit and healthy. What have you been doing for the last 2 months?
Look, about the only thing we've been allowed to do is exercise. We've been given more freedom to exercise in New South Wales than you've been given here in Victoria, and I've been making the most of it.
And one of the things I want to talk to you about is what is the lockdown and the government's reaction revealed about us as Australians? Is there anything that has surprised you? So at one level, I think there's been a great degree of national unity and we've come together in a real crisis and we've understood what needs to be done. But on the other hand, personally, I've been disappointed that I don't think there's been a quality of sacrifice. I think that this crisis has revealed the difference between those who are part of the productive economy and those who tell us how we should live our lives. Is there anything that struck you about this?
Yeah, let's get to that in a second, John. But just before we do, I'm very big on the need for accountability. Now, an elected politician is accountable. You are accountable every day to the media. You are accountable whenever Parliament sits to the other side of politics, and you are accountable to the people every 3 or 4 years at an election. So every elected politician is accountable for his or her life. No expert is accountable to anyone other than the vague concept of peer review, perhaps.
Whatever that might be.
And look, as a former health minister, I have a great deal of respect for the medical profession. When I was the health minister thinking about a potential pandemic back in the Howard government days, I worked very closely with the then Chief Medical Officer and the other experts. But in the end, the experts can advise. It's got to be the accountable politician who decides.
Have you been surprised by how quickly politicians, not just in Australia but around the world, seem to have hid behind medical experts and the science? And of course, when you talk about the medicine or the science or the evidence, it depends what scientist are you listening to. Are you listening to one from America, from Sweden, from here? Did that surprise you in any way?
Look, I frankly have been a little dismayed at how deferential the politicians have been. The elected accountable politicians have been to unelectable, unaccountable experts, particularly given that expert opinion is invariably contentious. One expert says one thing, another expert says another thing. If you take the corona crisis as a classic instance, we had the Imperial College epidemiologists claiming that the United Kingdom could lose up to 500,000 people. And then you had the Oxford University epidemiologists saying that, look, it's not nothing, it is serious, but it might not be all that much more serious than a severe flu season. Some people were saying that the death rates could be up to 5%, a bit like the Spanish flu pandemic. Others were saying very early on that it was much more likely that the death rate would be 0.3, 0.4%.
What does this say about politicians and what the public expect of politicians. It was almost as if, from my perspective, the public were happy to cede democracy, accountability, transparency from the politicians. They were happy to give it up to the experts. When did we become enthralled to the experts?
Well, this is a good question too, John. Now,
that's not the Australian way either, I would argue.
well, you know, a lot of people look at the politicians in the parliament and all they see is the argument at question time. And understandably enough, many people recoil from the combativeness of that, and they just want the whole thing to be more civil, more civilised, if you like, more polite. Can't we all agree? Hence the call for a consensus, hence the desire to listen to the experts and just do what we're told. And just do what we're told. Yeah. Now, look, we do have to take the experts seriously. We should, wherever we can, strive for unity. But as anyone who's ever been in a tight situation knows, someone has got to make a call. Inevitably, there will be contention about every hard call, and you don't succeed by splitting the difference and taking a lowest common denominator approach. To the extent that anyone can succeed in this vale of tears, it's normally by making the best call he or she can in the circumstances that you've got, with the facts as you know them to hand, and let the outcome vindicate the decision. I mean, I know we're going off into a different topic now, but
I think this is a really important discussion about democracy. So we had the beginning of the crisis, and you had the many sections of the media saying, at last, now we can hand politics back to the experts. We won't be democratic, we won't be populist, we won't be Trump-like. Let the experts, let the adults in the room take charge. And for me, that's profoundly undemocratic and very dangerous.
The last thing we want to do is live in a doctocracy. It should always be a democracy. I found myself thinking many weeks ago, recalling the words of Clemenceau, I think it was, who said, "War is too important to be left to the generals." Well, if I may paraphrase him, pandemics are far too important to be left to the doctors. In the end, it is vital that the elected politicians maintain direction of events, direction of policy. Yes, take the doctors seriously. Listen to all the epidemiologists, not just to the ones that are, as it were, banging the panic drum. Listen to all of them. Make the best decision you can, and then get on with it. And look, if down the track it turns out that things don't work out as you plan, sure, revise the decision you made earlier. But in the end, it's got to be the elected, accountable politician in charge.
And for me, that's one of the divisions I think we've seen between the experts and the Democrats and democracy. Another division that has struck so many people is that between the members of the productive economy, the people who are losing their jobs, the people who may come back to businesses that will never reopen, and the public sector, sections of the media, the tertiary sector, that have been telling the rest of Australia how to live without being directly impacted on it themselves. What does that say about Australia?
One of the most grating phrases of this whole pandemic has been, we're all in this together. Because frankly, we haven't been in it together. We have got a private sector calamity happening. And again, much as I respect the professionalism of the public service, no public servant has lost his or her job. No public servant has had his or her pay cut. In fact, in some states, their pay has been dramatically increased. In Victoria, I think politicians' pay has gone up, while there's been this massive job shedding in the private sector, and the people who've still got jobs have in many instances had a 20% pay cut. So look, let's not please repeat this grating phrase that we're all in this together, because what we are seeing out there at the moment is a calamity for the private sector.
Tony, as you know, the IPA situation is that there should be an equality of sacrifice in these difficult economic circumstances. An IPA Commission poll said something like 3/4 of Australians think there should be a 20% pay reduction for politicians and senior public servants.
Yeah.
I know you probably can't comment on what the government can do at the moment, but you did something very similar in 2014. Do you want to talk about that and your thinking behind that?
Okay, well, let's talk about the 20% pay cut, and then we'll talk about the 2014 budget. I'm not normally a big fan of the New Zealand Prime Minister, but as I understand it, members of Parliament and senior public servants in New Zealand have taken a 20% pay cut for 6 months. I certainly would like to think that all of the private sector workers in Australia who have taken a 20% pay cut
or more, yes,
will have their wages restored swiftly, because I want us to be a high wage country, not a low wage country. I think in this instance, following Jacinda Ardern temporarily reducing the salaries of MPs and, say, public servants earning over $150,000 a year would be a sensible thing to do. Now, to get on to your further point, and this is a more fundamental shift that's been going on for a long time. We used to talk about the working class, the middle class. These days, I think it's probably more meaningful to talk about the talking class and the doing class. Now, the talking class, public servants, university academics, people who talk for a living, analysts, experts of one sort or another. The numbers have increased, the prestige has increased. The doing classes, manufacturing workers, tradespeople, a lot of the professionals, engineers, technicians and so on, their numbers have, in many instances, shrunk, and their prestige has declined. I mean, the princes of the working class used to be auto workers, steel workers,
Boilermakers who used to enter Parliament.
Exactly right. And of course, the glory of the Labor Party in the old days was that if you were a boilermaker or an engine driver, in the case of Ben Chifley, you could, via the Labor Party, become Prime Minister. As Kim Beazley famously or infamously, depending upon your perspective, said back in, I think, the 1970s, when I entered Parliament, the Labor Party was the cream of the working class. As I leave Parliament, it becomes the dregs of the middle class. Now, interestingly, there have been further cultural shifts since then, and the middle class itself, as I think, has tended to differentiate
I think it's tended to split.
The doers and the talkers. And
just on that, when did talkers become disdainful of jobs? So during this debate we've had, well, it's the economy versus lives. Well, no, it's lives and lives, and the idea that every worker doesn't have an essential job, that some workers are more important than others. When did they become so disconnected
it's
from the real world?
Well, this is a very fair point. How did it happen? I suspect a part of it was when families didn't want their kids to do a trade. They wanted their kids to go to university. Yeah. Now, I'm all in favour of kids going to university, but just at the moment, I suspect that too many of our kids go to university, and not enough of our kids go and learn a trade. For instance, do we need more lawyers? No. Do we need more school teachers? No. Arguably, we need better school teachers, but we certainly don't need more. What we need more sparkies, we need more plumbers, we need more mechanics, we need more welders. You go on to major construction sites, and all too often, a lot of the people working there now are short-term workers from overseas. Now, again, I'm not against short-term workers from overseas. I think many of those short-term workers from overseas want to join our team and, in the fullness of time, become wonderful Australians. But nevertheless, no family should be in any way embarrassed if their son or daughter decides to become a hairdresser rather than a school teacher, or decides to become a nurse rather than a doctor.
And the private sector hasn't done, in recent years, a very good job at arguing for the private sector, for economic freedom, and those supporting government have done a wonderful job at arguing for bigger government and higher taxes.
One of the interesting shifts in recent times has been the way large business has really
vacated the field.
Exactly right. I mean, public companies have really lost their mojo, I think.
No, I'd correct you. They've lost their mojo for some things. They've gained their mojo for identity politics, for trendy popular causes, but not for wealth creation.
Look, I couldn't help but notice the enthusiasm of large public companies to take a position on same-sex marriage, for argument's sake. Very few of them were prepared to take a position on, the need for a less regulated economy, the need for more freedom
and
in
even
the marketplace.
During this crisis, a number of business leaders, one or two, said we need to start to begin to get back to work.
Yeah.
They were followed by no one.
I know. Too many big public companies have basically become private sector bureaucracies. And it's interesting that the really dynamic large companies still tend to be virtually family businesses, News, Lynn Fox,
and
Visi,
and individuals with a vision for the future.
They're founder-led often, or they still have large aspects of the family company about them. They've got a strong ethos, a strong culture. They haven't been taken over by a professional managerial class whose main loyalty seems to be to their pay packet.
So talking about the professional managerial class, that leads us into the future coming out of this. If we want to think about the future, let's go to where we were. What sort of country was Australia 3 months ago? Going into this, as we chart a way out, what were the characteristics of the country 3 months ago?
Well, what are the characteristics of Australia? We're prosperous, we're free, we're fair. The two things that I think most characterise Australia are this instinct for the fair go, but the corresponding instinct to have a go. And I keep saying, if you want to get a go, you've got to give a go. If you want to get a fair go, you've got to have a go.
Now, I'm going to ask you about the second part in particular. And talk to me about the have a go. Do we still have that? Red tape is Australia's largest industry. Less small businesses are being started than ever before in our history. More people are wanting to go into a public sector that is growing. Do we still have that have a go culture that I think we once had?
Well, interestingly, John, I think the bushfires showed the have-a-go spirit. In New South Wales, there were tens of thousands of volunteer firefighters out there.
We raised tens of millions of dollars.
We raised tens of millions of dollars for the fire services, for the victims, for bushfire recovery and so on. Lots of people rallied to the stricken communities. We had volunteers going in at every level to try to help. So look, I think the have-a-go spirit is alive and well. It's just that it needs the right circumstances to come to the fore, and too often circumstances, particularly government, can conspire to crush it. And for me,
is government crushing it more?
Well, for me, the dispiriting aspect of the current crisis, the corona crisis, is that we aren't being told to go out and fight for our country. We're being told to stay at home. Don't be active for your country, be passive for your country. Now, I think that is a dispiriting position. I'm not saying that an element of it wasn't necessary, but it's a fundamentally dispiriting position to adopt. We are not by nature a passive people.
That dispiriting view of how we participate, some would argue, has been adopted and accepted and embraced by such a large part of the community. 60 to 70% of Australians are not uncomfortable with aspects of what has happened.
Yeah, and look, I can understand people watching the footage from Italy when their hospital system was melting down. I can certainly understand the real fear that gripped large sections of our community for a few weeks there from the middle of March on. But look, I always think we should take counsel of our hopes at least as much of our fears. And I don't want us to be a frightened and fearful people. Sure, there are real threats. If you're at sea in a storm, that's a real threat. If you're in front of a fire front, that's a real threat. If the brakes fail in your car, that's a real problem. But we have become pretty good at scaring ourselves, at over scaring ourselves. We should face the future with courage and ultimately with confidence. We should never allow ourselves to think that the situation is hopeless and we're all doomed unless we take some drastic and largely destructive action.
And that applies to many walks of life.
Well, of course it does. I mean, the obvious case in recent times is climate change. Now, nuclear annihilation was a real prospect when the United States and the old Soviet Union were at loggerheads. It could become a real prospect again, depending upon how things develop with China. But without wanting to distract this discussion, climate change is not in the same league. The idea that the world is going to be fundamentally changed by a difference of a couple of degrees in temperature over several decades, it just doesn't rate in terms of serious threats.
And talking of climate change and the political contours of the community, you a little while ago gave some remarks to the International Democratic Union that were very significant, and then your remarks were published in an article in the Australian, and you made some really important points that I want to ask you about. The first point you talked about was the fact that we're going to be giving up some of the things we've focused on. We're focused on identity politics. We've understood that red tape has been too large a part of our lives, and some of these things are now going to go. Can you talk a little bit about this? You said that we have suffered a big hit to the economy. We've suffered long-lasting change, and now we have to start to rebuild.
A real crisis puts everything else into perspective. The corona crisis has not been nearly as severe in Australia as in other countries, but it was a real crisis. I don't want to minimise it, even though I think that the lockdown in response was, with the wisdom of hindsight, probably too severe, and certainly it's gone on for too long. And in the face of the experience of something which can and does kill people, something which hasn't killed anyone, and which needn't kill anyone, I think should take its proper perspective. Now, the other thing about the corona crisis is it will lead to a massive hit on our prosperity, an absolutely massive hit on our prosperity, even if the economy bounces straight back in the coming weeks and months. There will be a $200 billion plus burden of debt
will pay for.
that will ultimately have to be paid for. So whatever way you look at it, there are going to be very serious long-term adverse economic consequences from this. And given this unexpected element of impoverishment, the last thing we should be doing is further policy-induced impoverishment in the name of something like reducing emissions. Now, obviously, I think we should rest as lightly as we can on the only planet that we've got. But the idea that we should further add to our costs, further inhibit jobs, further increase our costs in a extreme effort to reduce emissions, I think will look even crazier in the future than it did in the past.
Do you think government will inevitably become bigger as a result of this?
No, it shouldn't. It absolutely shouldn't. We should, as swiftly as possible, move to end all the extra spending, to end all the additional restrictions, and in so doing, in moving back to normalcy, we should try to make it a better normalcy in the recent future than it's been in the recent past.
The arguments of
so we should try to get some of the, I think, the ideological anxieties, climate change, identity politics, gender fluidity, all this kind of stuff. Let's see these things for what they were, fads essentially, intellectual fads, to put it at its kindest, and let's focus on what really matters, which is having a richer, freer, fairer and more successful society in the future than we've had in the recent past.
And to come back to an earlier point that you made, so you don't believe it's inevitable that government will get bigger, that the public will expect more from government, that the public will trust public servants more?
Not at all. Now,
this is an important point that you're making.
I do think that people are waking up to the real nature of the Chinese communist regime, and even highly orthodox establishment figures like Dennis Richardson are now saying that we need to increase our military spending beyond 2%, up towards 3% of GDP. If that's Dennis's view, I think we have to take increases in military spending very seriously. It's also become glaringly obvious that we do need more self-sufficiency in some areas of manufacturing. Now,
is that
government will have to take some action there.
Is that tariffs?
But that doesn't mean that government will have to directly produce medicines, directly produce PPE, etc. itself. Government should sensibly work with the private sector to ensure that we are more resilient in what might be described as the essentials of modern life.
How do we avoid the old tariff regime? How do we avoid putting up the drawbridge?
Yeah. Well, again, I think it's got to be much more sophisticated. What I would like to see us do is, if you like, an audit, a very thorough audit of exactly what we can and can't do in this country. And then we need to have a very thorough discussion of what we think we must be able to do in this country and what we think we can rely on others, and which others for.
Is that a new economic nationalism, or is it something different?
Well, again, I think it's simply, the best way to produce things is invariably by maximising the use of the market. But
not having the world's most expensive electricity, some of the world's most restrictive labour laws, some of the world's most extensive red tape.
But we do still want to have some of the world's highest wages.
That's right.
Because we
and
want
a social safety net.
We want our people to be well off. But if we want to stay well off, we've got to be smarter than we necessarily have recently been. Smarter and just more savvy, if you like, not just academic intelligence, but savvy, street smart intelligence. That's what we need. So there may be some things that we're perfectly happy to rely on the world for. There may be other things that we're only prepared to rely on our friends for. And there may be further things that we feel we need to rely on ourselves for. So I think these are the sorts of conversations that we need to have.
Have politicians been honest with the public about this? So for a long time we've heard there's actually a moral equivalence between China and the United States. A lot of people have argued, well, there's not one, might be an official ally, but there's not that big a difference. I think Australia's now understanding there is a difference.
Just as in the old days, some people argued moral equivalence between the United States and the Soviet Union.
Right.
Plainly, there was no moral equivalence. Right. And look, I am pro-China, but I am very much not pro the current Chinese government. And while as Prime Minister, I was more than happy to conclude a free trade agreement with China. I think, remarkably, China actually gave more than we did in that free trade agreement. Our economy was already very open. They actually opened theirs up somewhat to us. But the reality is that over the last 5 years, what have we seen from China? We've seen the militarisation of the South China Sea. We've seen bullying of its neighbours, repression in Hong Kong, belligerence towards Taiwan. We've seen the internment of perhaps 1 million Uyghurs. We've seen this grotesque social credit system, 1984 on steroids, if you like, of kind of high-tech enforced conformism. We've had President Xi declare himself emperor for life. This is a different China. At least we understand the difference more clearly than perhaps we did 5 years ago. And that, I think, needs to inform our actions in the years ahead.
And some of this reassessment is going to involve Australia becoming more confident about itself. It is going to involve Australians understanding things that we've spoken about, our culture, our institutions, our freedoms, 2,000 years of Western civilization that has given us a liberal democracy. As we draw to this conversation to a conclusion, how do we rediscover some of that confidence? So it used to be the conversation that Australians and Australian governments don't pick winners. In fact, we've picked lots of winners. We've picked institutions that have critiqued our culture. We've picked an education curriculum that has criticised our nation. How do we rebalance some of this conversation towards mainstream Australian values and understand our successes, also appreciate our weaknesses, but build confidence of what we are as a country? So we've got in the bookshelf Douglas Murray, the great British journalist who, of course, came to Australia, and he said, I've been to very few countries that seem to not like themselves as much as Australia does. How do we overcome that?
Well, I'm not saying that you can just change the zeitgeist overnight, but if more of us are more truthful about our strengths as well as about our weaknesses, if more of us are more truthful about our opportunities as well as just our perils. If more of us are more confident about our ability to meet challenges and beat them, well, I think we will be so much better off. I mean, I spent a bit of time as a youngster playing rugby and ultimately coaching rugby teams. You only win if you have persuaded your team that they can win. You never win a sporting encounter by demoralising your own team. And too many people in leadership positions in our country have been busy demoralising us for too long, whether they're school teachers and university lecturers with the black armband view of history, whether it's politicians of the left scaring us to death over climate change, whether it's, I suppose, politicians of the right who have sometimes succumbed to cultural despair. I think we just need so much more of a can-do attitude. Now, it's not going to be easy. Life is not easy, as one of my predecessors once said. But it's livable if we have the right approach.
Tony Abbott, thank you so much.
Thanks, John.